COVID-19 spread across the country and the globe in the spring and summer, glimmers of hope began to emerge. Cases were down and the death rate was falling. Americans began to hope the pandemic was subsiding, that vaccines would soon be available, and that life as we knew it might return. Predictably, this turned out to be a false dawn. As people living in the Northern Hemisphere began to move their lives indoors, infections, hospitalizations, and deaths have spiked. Winter is coming, and COVID is once again accelerating, and this time leaving no corner of the country or the planet untouched. While COVID health concerns are top of mind, there's growing evidence that another wave of economic impacts is on its way at home and abroad. To discuss what he calls the coming dark economic winter, I'm joined today by Desmond Lachman, a resident fellow at AEI who focuses on international finance and trade and monetary policy. We discuss his recent article in the Hill newspaper on what our world's collective economic future may look like in light of rising debt levels brought on by loose monetary policies, and how those effects are likely to be felt most strongly in the developing world. Desmond Lachman, thank you for joining us here on Hardly Working. Really great to have you. You've been at AEI for a while, and you're one of our senior finance guys and economists at AEI. And I wonder if you could just walk us through a little bit of your own personal background, your career leading up to AEI, how you chose your field, or did your field choose you, that kind of thing.
Well, I'd say that I had an interest in economics. I started studying law and economics. I thought I was going to do law, but I changed course. That was back in South Africa, during the late 60s. And then I got attracted to economics, that I had a very charismatic professor, came from Berlin University. It helps also that he shared the same surname as I had. And he really just got me very interested in what happened in the 1930s, what happened to economics, how the whole system nearly broke down. And through the idea of John Maynard Keynes, things really got on the mend, so that really ignited an interest. So I left South Africa, studied in England. I studied at Cambridge University, did economics there, had under the supervision of people who had studied with Keynes. So that was rather an interesting experience. And then I had the opportunity to work at the International Monetary Fund. They recruited me from England, and that brought me to the United States in the early 70s. That was just the place to be for an economist. You deal with 150 different countries, that all got different sorts of problems. So I spent quite a long career there. I spent something like 24 years there. And then I thought, after such a long stint in public service, I thought I'd go off to Wall Street, see what the real world was like, look at markets. And I worked at Salomon Brothers for a number of years. They, of course, got merged into Citibank in the end, but I was at Salomon when it was still Salomon Brothers, and that was rather an exciting time in terms of economics. We had the Asian crisis, the Russian crisis, and so on. So I haven't lost the interest, in finding out, how countries work, what policies can be done to remedy things. And that living as we do in this age, there's no shortage of topics that are worthy of studying, that it's really quite different, quite a diverse and very challenging time in which we live. And finally, I landed up, I came to AI around about 2003, and I've been doing research at AI, writing a lot about the international economy and also the US economy and anything that's got to do with trade, economic growth, business to do with currencies. That is really what my field is. I don't have regrets that I chose economics as a career.
So I want to go back and just have you talk a little bit about your career at the IMF. What exactly did you work on, or what kinds of things did you work on at the IMF?
Well, the IMF, you've got a lot of people who working on countries. What they're doing is they're going and negotiating lending programs with countries that might get themselves into trouble. On the balance of payment side, they need support, they need advice as to how to deal with their country. So I started off in the IMF working on Latin American countries. I worked on quite a number of them. And, in the later stage of my career on Latin America, I used to lead the IMF missions to Argentina, which always would get into some sort of currency trouble, or, they'd have very irresponsible budget policies. And one would negotiate what was called a standby arrangement with those countries, where the IMF, in return for the money that it gave them, it would require that they remedied their policies, in a way that was in both their interest and in the international system's interest. The more exciting part of my career at the IMF was when I moved off to work on Europe, and I had involvement in Sweden. In 1992, Sweden had a major currency crisis. So this was a different item, for the IMF, dealing with a country that was advanced, developed. You'd think that they wouldn't get into trouble. And
especially not the Swedes, right? I mean, they're sort of the paradigm of responsible governance, or at least they're understood that way.
Well, the Swedes always remember that they had to jack up interest rates to 500% to try to defend the currency. So, that is a measure of how badly out of whack things got. I was rather surprised, Sweden in 1992, I was rather surprised how they seem to be isolated. They seem to be on the outside of what was going on, in the rest of Europe. And this crisis came as a real surprise to them. And I was surprised that, an institution like the IMF had something to say to a country that is the seat of where the Nobel Prizes are given. That was a little bit odd, but that was very rewarding experience. And then, of course,
before we move on from that, I just want to ask. I mean, you talk about dealing with Argentina, which is sort of renowned for its bad economic management, budget management, and then with Sweden having its own crisis. Did they arise from a similar source? Those two crises?
No, I think that Argentina, the crises there are deeper rooted, that it's a problem between their provinces and the central government, and that it's a weak central government, and the provinces always manage to do their own thing, and it's not done in a very coordinated way, and it becomes highly politicized. Sweden was different. Sweden was running through a period of political instability, which didn't always characterize it. Sweden used to have a Labour government that always had a majority, so that it had very stable government. The government that I was dealing with was a coalition government, that got itself into trouble. There were four parties in a coalition pulling in different directions. In the end is they ran into a major crisis.
Was it if I recall correctly, and I may be wrong about this, but it was a question of sort of Sweden getting to the end of being able to sustain the welfare state that it had created? Was that the principal cause?
That was part of it, but the other part was that they, like the UK, the UK got into similar trouble at around about the same time. They wanted to join the euro, so they fixed their currency, but what they did is they didn't have the policies to support the currency being fixed. And when they didn't have their budget under control and they didn't have good supervision on the banks, the whole thing came apart in a spectacular way. But the same sort of thing occurred to the UK
Okay, yeah,
a few months before. This was the famous ERM
Rem,
crisis in
right.
1992. You know, Sweden was a little bit further down the road, but it was the same idea that countries were trying to peg their exchange rates to get into the euro, but they didn't have the policies that supported it.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, very, very interesting, fascinating background, and it'll help, I think, listeners to understand a bit about your what you lay out in this editorial that you wrote for the Hill newspaper, and you entitled it "A Dark Economic Winter." And was that a deliberate allusion to Joe Biden's discussion of the dark COVID winter?
Well, it wasn't Joe Biden. Well, Joe Biden might have been discussing it. I was looking more, dispassionately, without getting into the politics. I was looking at what the health experts were saying, that including one of our more famous alumni, Scott Gottlieb. They were warning that the United States didn't have much of a COVID-19 policy to speak of, and that they were warning that as we would go into the winter months, we'd see this incredible spike in cases, we'd see a spike in illnesses. And I was just making a connection between deteriorating health picture and the likelihood that that would spill over into the economy. So, what we're seeing right now is in Europe, that Europe thought that they had this pandemic under control, and now it's spiking a lot in Europe. So what you're seeing is Europe, countries as diverse as the United Kingdom, Ireland, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, all of them are rolling back the lockdown, the easing of the lockdown that they had earlier in the year. So the story is, both in Europe and the United States, is that we had the crisis around about the spring. We didn't know too much about this health crisis. We probably panicked. We put on too many controls too quickly in order to try to see to it. And what that did is it caused the greatest economic recession that we've had, in the past 90 years. Then what happened is that as the lockdown was eased, as we went into the summer months and that it looked like this was coming off, so we took off restrictions, what you got is you got an incredible bounce back in the economy. So, the numbers in the United States, that you look at annualized terms, we declined by something like 30% in the second quarter, only to bounce back by something like 30% in the third quarter. So, this looked like this was a sharp V-shaped recovery. But the point I'm making is that if we don't have the health item under control, then it's very likely that we're going to have to roll back, at least to some degree, the easing of the lockdown that made that recovery so strong. And I'm also arguing that even if we don't roll it back, if governments don't do this, that introduce restrictions, the public itself will pull back, so people won't be that keen to travel. They won't be keen to go to restaurants, stay at hotels, all of those things, sports events, all of those parts of the economy will be hit. Now, what I'm arguing as well is that we can ill afford this at a time that the Federal Reserve is telling us, quite clearly that the data that they're looking at is indicating that after the strong bounce of the economy in the third quarter, all of the numbers are pointing to the economy slowing down. So we can't afford to take, another hit to the economy. And what's bothering me right now is that if I look at the numbers, the latest numbers on this COVID, it's not just a question that we're now at like 120, 130,000 cases a day, whereas in some of the previous peak, we were at, say, 65, 70,000. So we're at like double where we were at the previous peak. But what really bothers me is that we're growing. Those cases are rising now at a fortnightly rate. So in other words, every 14 days, it increases by 50 or 60%. So, I'm concerned that before the vaccine comes into play, which we're really only expecting the vaccine to come into play in a serious way by the first quarter of the year, we've now got to get through the winter with cases that are likely to be very high. So that was another argument for not being complacent about where the economy is. The economy clearly needs some kind of support now, because we really don't want this recovery to run out of steam.
Yeah, I think that's on everybody's mind, or at least it should be on everybody's mind, that we're, as you pointed out, we've lagged Europe by 3 months throughout this crisis, and now we're lagging them, by a few weeks probably, in terms of the surge that they're dealing with. And it's a very important and interesting point. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about, government shouldn't impose these restrictions on the economy, that, we should just pretty much allow people to go about their business, try to protect the vulnerable as much as we can, not lock down. But the reality is that it isn't government that locks down, it's people who lock down. We saw that early on in the crisis in the United States. The restaurants in New York were closed long before the government moved to shut them down. Yeah.
Right. No, I'd buy that. And that's part of my argument, is that even if you don't have the rollback mandated by states and so on, you would get it occurring anyway. But it seems that, there are countries that have been really very successful. They're mainly Asian countries. For instance, like if you look at Taiwan hasn't had a case now, for quite a while, or it's at an incredibly low level. The same thing we're finding in Australia, the same thing we're finding in New Zealand, that what they've done is they've taken this rather seriously, that they've just closed off their economies, they've stopped travel, they've perhaps taken a hit, but that's put them in a position to now recover, in a way that we don't. I would just think that there's some kind of health measures. I would certainly, I think it was a huge mistake at the beginning to shut down in an indiscriminate kind of way. That I think that you can do it in a way that you allow young people, to go to work. You have testing in place. You have old people. You protect them in a different kind of way. You treat different parts of the population in different ways. But it would be a huge mistake now, if we shut down the economy for a week or two, because that's really got consequences. That's the fact. We've certainly got a health crisis, but I wouldn't minimize the fact that at one stage we had 20 million people out of work. We've still got something like 11 million people out of work. Businesses are getting disrupted. There's a huge amount of stress. There are other illnesses that take place. So, the economy, one really doesn't want to let the health officials, run away with this, that they'd want to shut everything down. I think you've really got to try to get the right balance.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And the way I've always thought about this is that if you have all of the other things, if you have social distancing and masking policies and testing and the panoply of tools in place, you can manage it. What happens if you don't have those things is that you're stuck with a shutdown, because that becomes the only tool that you've got. And I think that's where we got stuck earlier this year, is that the thing was out of control before we knew it was there. We had to, you called it panicking. I might say it was kind of the only tool in the bag to try to get ahead of it. But I agree that at this point, it doesn't really make sense to think about, statewide, nationwide kinds of lockdowns. We have much better tools at hand that we can use to manage this if we choose to. And then you look at states, in the upper Midwest right now, where they just they haven't managed the crisis at all, up until now. And now they're really paying a price in places like the Dakotas and Wisconsin and some other states that just never took this seriously. And now that it's endemic in the community, you can't get away from it.
Yeah, well, I guess the good news is the vaccine, that if somehow we can hold out till March, April, we should be in a good place. I think that what's changed the last few days is that it looks like there's an end in sight, which makes this a lot more tolerable. Perhaps people will take a different attitude, that this is not going to be something permanent, so perhaps they reduce the risks that they're taking.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it does feel like, okay, if we can just get past the first of the year, the vaccine will start coming online. We'll be able to actually protect the vulnerable populations the way that we say that we want to. That opens up a whole lot of much better choices for the country. If we can say to the elderly, we're going to protect you. If we can say to our healthcare workers, we're going to be able to immunize you so that you don't have to worry about getting sick yourself. All of that will begin to take the pressure, I think, off the healthcare system and off public psychology, which is a big part of the battle, I think. So we've been talking a lot about the U.S. side of this, but this is a global phenomenon, and it occurs in both dimensions, both the public health dimension and the economic dimension, kind of around the world. So why don't you take us through that a little bit? Particularly the concerns that you outlined in your piece about the emerging market debt crisis, which I found fascinating and had not connected to COVID before I read your piece.
Right. Well, there are two things that are going on, it seems, with when you look at the emerging markets. One is the impact of this COVID crisis. So as far as the emerging markets are concerned, many of them have been faced with, what one would call a perfect economic storm. They're the disruptions that come directly from the COVID itself. But then as soon as the global economy slows, these countries find that their commodity prices, global commodity prices drop. Just think of oil. They're not earning money from that. Workers abroad don't send back the same amounts of money that they did before. That the economies like the US and Europe, as they slow down, their markets slow. So, from the emerging markets point of view, they really get hit very hard. And they went into this crisis in rather poor shape. So they went into this crisis with a lot of debt to begin with. Now they get thrown into a massive recession, which means that their budgets go out of kilter, both because as they get depressed, they don't collect the tax revenues, but then also because they're spending money on health, to try to protect their populations. So if their public finances look shaky before, they're now beyond the pale. That is the one part that is going on. The other part that is going on is because the Federal Reserve responded the way in which the Federal Reserve did, by cutting interest rates again like crazy to 0%, and then by expanding its balance sheet by $3 trillion, I just stress it's not billion, it's $3 trillion. They did that in the space of 5 months. So what's happened is that, once again, it's like what occurred after 2008, 2009. The global economy is swimming with liquidity. Interest rates are very low. And in that kind of environment, investors are looking for something that is returning them some kind of yield. And they're not really asking question, is this a viable proposition in a year or two? So the money is flowing back into these emerging market countries, and masking the underlying rot that is going on. But, at some point when the music stops, we're really going to have debt crises. And
let me ask you, what do you mean by the underlying rot?
Well, the underlying rot is that the public finances are just not stable. So to give you an example, Brazil went into the crisis with a debt to GDP ratio of 80%. That is very high for an emerging market economy. It's already at the threshold where you're seeing red flags. Comes the crisis, their budget deficit blows out to something like 17% of GDP, the economy dives. So this ratio suddenly goes to 100% of GDP and is off to the races because their deficit's not going to come down anytime soon. So that is a situation where normally what you'd say is this country is not going to be able to pay its debt. It needs to restructure its debt. It needs to get better control of its public finances. It needs an IMF program to put it back on the rails. No, what's going on is because the money is flowing so freely globally, Brazil is able to finance this deficit. So as soon as the interest rates in the United States start rising, or as soon as there's some event in the world that makes people think, hey, wait a minute, we can lose all of our money if we're lending to these deadbeat kind of countries, that's when you'll get the debt crisis. And this is a view, I've certainly got that view, but it's also a view which I find interesting, is that seems to be the World Bank's baseline view. The World Bank is warning that, we've really got big debt problems, whether it's in a year or whether it's in 2 years' time. This is certainly not a viable proposition. And what's important to bear in mind is that the emerging market countries aren't what they were 20 years ago. Now they're half the global economy. If you get problems in a number of these large emerging market countries, that can spill over, to us. So, I'm just suggesting that is another reason why we really can't be too complacent about the US economy slowing, because the US economy, there might be one or two shocks coming from abroad that derail the US recovery.
So let's play this out just a little bit. So we already talked about the vaccine coming online. The markets in the United States rebounded strongly on that news, 1,200 points on the stock exchange, and I believe yields on treasuries started to rise. So as the U.S. outlook improves, that would tend to drive up interest rates, not just here, but in Brazil or Argentina or wherever in the developing world, in the emerging markets. Is that right? Is that how this works? Yeah,
that's one way in which this can work. And, that we had that experience in the emerging markets in 2013, when Ben Bernanke mentioned that he was thinking of, the term they used was normalizing US monetary policy, which basically meant begin to run down their balance sheets, to reduce the size of their balance sheet, to begin raising interest rates. And that gave rise to what was known as the Bernanke tantrum, that the markets had this temper tantrum because Bernanke dared as much as to say that he might raise interest rates, so the money went flowing out of the emerging market countries, and, a lot of them really got into trouble. And if I recall, Bernanke had to back off, what he was planning to do. But that's essentially the point. So, that one way you can think of the scenario playing out, I mean, this is less likely now that we've got an election result where there's a split between the administration and Congress. The fact that the Republicans will control the Senate, that makes this less likely. But what you could do is, if you have a very expansive fiscal policy, that can force the interest rates up a lot sooner than we're thinking about. But that would be the way in which the music stopped. And that we've seen that a number of, I've seen that too many times, for it not to be occurring. So, I'm saying that this is all fine, that the easy money papers over the really bad allocation of capital, just allowing countries, to go on in their way. But at some point when that stops, we get the disruption. Now, the trouble with the disruption is that can have an impact on United States financial markets. We saw that with the Asian crisis. We saw it with the Russian debt default. You then find that some financial institution, in its wisdom, got over its head lending to this particular country, and then they need a bailout. That's really at the risk.
So it's like even the good news is bad news, is what I'm hearing you say. I mean, like, we develop the vaccine, we get the vaccine in place, the economy, confidence is restored, people are able to get back to work and producing. That's all good, but there's a huge price tag to be paid, probably both domestically, but especially internationally, for what we've had to do to ride out this problem.
Yeah, well, internationally, while we were printing the money, that was good for them. As soon as we start taking the money out, that's going to show
Right.
how artificial it was. Now, an important point with the vaccine, when you look at the international economy, the news that we got this week on the vaccine is terrific news for the United States. But for the rest of the world, it's not that great, because what seems to be occurring is that the United States is going to make sure that every United States citizen gets the right to have the vaccine, but the vaccines aren't going to be available to the rest of the world. So these countries, that, and I'm thinking right now of Europe, forget about the emerging market economies. Europe itself is going to be way behind the United States as to when they get the vaccine. So while the vaccine is going to be good for the United States in the near term, it's only going to be good for these countries further down the pike. So they've got a long time that they're still going to have to deal with. They're going to have to deal with this pandemic, and if their economies take a hit, another hit, that can really be problematic for the United States, because the debt problem isn't only an emerging market problem. The debt problem is, that if I look at countries like in Europe, country like Italy has never had debt at these sort of levels, and their public finances have never looked this bad. So that's not a very sustainable situation. They have to get their economies growing very quickly, if they're not going to run into another debt crisis themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a really good word. I mean, the way that the administration set up the vaccine development was, U.S. first, and that's completely understandable from a, political, even a public health standpoint. But we are intimately connected to all these other nations, and our fate is bound up in theirs as well. So we've got to figure out how to start sharing the wealth, as it were, related to the vaccine, not for their good, although it is good for them, but for in our own interests, to make sure that they don't experience the kind of lag you're talking about. So, Desmond, if you were then in charge of policy at this point, what are the 2 or 3 things that you would be telling both the U.S. and the U.S., the Europeans, the emerging markets? What would you be recommending to them in terms of immediate policy to manage what sounds like is going to be a very difficult transition back to something closer to normal?
Well, I guess, the 2 things would be, to have a sensible health policy, what we've been discussing, not one of these blanket lockdowns, to have something that is more targeted, that makes use of testing, tracing, and the like, to keep the health problem under control, at least until we've got the vaccine in place. And then I would say, certainly for the United States, and that would also be true for Europe, is that there's need for more fiscal support to the economy. So one of the mistakes that we keep making, or that we made, in my view, in 2008, is we don't do enough on the budget side, and we leave all of the heavy lifting to be done by monetary policy. And then what occurs with monetary policy can do it, but it can only do it at a cost of distorting all of these capital markets. So what it does is it solves a problem in the near term, but by building a very big problem down the road. So, I'd want to see a better balance. I'd want to see less of the effort to get recovery going being placed on Congress, on the budget, and go less on the Federal Reserve.
So more on Congress, less on the Federal Reserve. You said less on Congress. I just wanted to
more on Congress, less on the Federal Reserve. But at the same time, what I think we've really got to be careful about, and I seem to be the only person talking about it anymore, is we've really got to worry about our debt. What happens to our debt is going to come back and bite us later on. So this notion that seems to be in vogue right now is if interest rates are low, budget deficits don't matter, the public debt doesn't matter. I think that's baloney. That is really going to catch us later on. So, my advice would be that in terms of fiscal policy, you certainly need fiscal policy support, but you need to do it in a way that minimizes the amount of debt you build up in the process. So what you need to do is look at the expenditure side, things that give you a lot of bang for the buck. Those are the kind of things that you should do, but you shouldn't do what we did in this CARES Act. I haven't analyzed it that carefully, but it just looks so wasteful in so many ways. You gave loans to people to keep on workers. They were going to be keeping them on anyway. So why, kind of like a few $100 billion here and a few $100 billion there. What we've done is we've built up the debt in a way that I think mortgages our future. So I'm a big proponent of providing the economy with support, but not happily throwing around numbers like $2 trillion, $3 trillion, as if it's kind of doesn't really make a difference. Somebody's going to have to pay for that in the end. I think we've really got to be very much more disciplined and very much more careful, in how we go about fiscal.
So am I hearing you say you weren't a fan of the PPE or the
CARES Act?
The CARES Act, but the segment of that funding that went to businesses.
Yeah, that it should have been targeted. There has to have been a better way of doing this than just in a blanket way. And providing wasteful kind of stuff, people getting those loans who don't really need them, and people who need them aren't really getting them. It doesn't make sense. I think that you're really wanting to target your fiscal response, as I say, in a way that does the job of getting the economy going, but doesn't have a lot of wasteful elements to it.
What do you make of the expanded unemployment insurance for workers? The $600 a week, and the sort of the federal supplement to state unemployment benefits.
So, there you can, one can argue that there are disincentives, that one's seen that the disincentives, that if people are earning more by staying unemployed than going to employment, that creates a problem later on, getting people back into the workforce. But, I'd be more of a fan of, what seemed to be, like Milton Friedman's helicopter money, giving families, in need, giving them the money to spend, you don't have a disincentive, for them to go to work. Right. I mean, one really needs to look at it, look at this rather carefully. But, I realize that this is very optimistic, that this is going to be done in a political way. It's the same thing, we saw that in 2000 and, with the Obama 2009
Recovery Act.
Act. It was the same thing. There was just a whole lot of pork in it, which, is really, we're not in a position, one of the things with the United States is even before the pandemic occurred, our public finances weren't in good shape. So it just looks, I'm worried about, from a longer run point of view in Washington, is there seems to be no constituency for sound public finances. That seems to have gone out of the window. The Republicans, the 4 years with President Trump, that there was, in my view, there was absolutely no excuse for having fiscal stimulus at a time that the economy was strong. That was the time that you should have been fixing your public finances. I'm not saying that I'm against a tax cut, far from it. But if the tax cut is unfunded, I'm against that. Just happily building up debt is not the way to go.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You've helped me to understand something about the way that monetary policy is another way of doing that, of shifting the burden down the road or to other people. With the way that monetary policy has been handled, it's actually the developing world that's going to pay for our loose money. Or they're going to pay the biggest price. We'll all pay, but they're going to pay the biggest price for our loose money policies, which I hadn't really thought about.
But it's, it's not, the emerging markets is just one aspect of how Federal Reserve money has distorted credit markets. So, you get countries that, shouldn't have borrowed in the first place. A lot of these African countries should never have been in the capital markets in the first place. They weren't creditworthy, but they got the money, because of easy Fed policy. But you've got stuff domestically as well, so you've got, Janet Yellen worries about, she worries now, she didn't worry when she was in office, but she's worried now about how Fed easy money policy has led to loans by companies that are highly leveraged with bad quality. These are the highly leveraged loans. We've got something like $1.5 trillion of these loans that have been made to companies that, as soon as you get into a recession of any sort, these companies are all going to default. So it's the whole system is filled with, at least my view, is filled with, very bad loans that will then weigh down on future growth at a later stage.
Well, that is very reminiscent of 2008, 2009, isn't it? The bad loans coming due. Desmond, this has been a fascinating conversation. If people are interested in reading more of your work, where should they go?
If they go to the website at AEI, they just go to the AEI website, bring me down as the scholar, or just go directly to my page. They can Google me. they find, I'm finding I'm writing a fair bit now because, as I say, every time I think I've run out of anything to say, I just see there's a new problem.
Right. That's what we're there for, right? Is to worry about problems. That's what I think think tanks are for. So it's been great talking with you. Thank you so much for writing the piece. I thought it was fascinating. We'll make sure that we get it out to our listeners and encourage everybody to go to the website. Are you on Twitter by chance?
Twitter, I belong to the wrong generation.
Okay. No need to go any further. I just wanted to make sure if you were there and you were tweeting, we want to be able to follow you there too as well. So thanks so much for your time, and we'll have you back again to talk more about economics and labor markets and the economy.
Well, very good to talk to you, and thanks for inviting me.
You bet. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Hardly Working. I'm your host, Brent, and I hope you tune in next time to learn more about the state of workforce development in America. Be sure to like and subscribe to our podcast. Let us know at vocation@aei.org if there are any topics you'd like us to cover. As always, we hope you find the job that fits so well it feels like you're hardly working.